Well, let's go ahead and get started here. Let's see. Grading, I am slowly catching up. I haven't finished text corrections for this section yet. I should have those updated on Moodle by tonight. Those questions you submitted for the final exam, those 4 questions, I am in the middle of compiling that document. That should be done this afternoon, available on Moodle, so you can use that as extra study material. Let's see. Otherwise, any questions about final, what's coming up? Today's last content day. Friday we're doing exam review, scientific literacy. All right, no questions, I like it. So we left off last Monday with this question that we hadn't answered yet. But it should be a fairly simple question to answer. So I'm going to give you a minute to tell me which line, maybe I'll give you the answer too. Which line shows logistic or which line shows exponential growth? So much more energy than my class beforehand. I really just sat in silence during all my questions. Oh yeah. All right, this red line here that just keeps going up and up and up, what type of growth would that be? Exponential, yes, resources are not limited for this population, which means the other one is logistic. It starts to plateau out once it hits that carrying capacity. All right, any questions on this? Be more straightforward than some of our other content. All right, so we're going to move into talking about species interactions today, which is the last bit of content. If you, say, downloaded the study guide or looked at it like last week, you'll notice that there are questions about ecosystem ecology. We're not even going to get to that. I've gone back to the study guide and crossed those questions out. So if you downloaded it ahead of time, you might want to just double check that I haven't crossed those questions out. I did cross out a few other questions as well, questions that we just did not get to in that content, and I would not expect you to know. So our last bit is species interactions, right? And so far we've been talking about populations, right? A single species, many of those species in a population. Now we're going to move on to talk about communities. And communities are all of the species in a general area at a given time. So if we look at the fish swimming in this ocean here, not only are there different species of fish, there's different species of coral, there's probably different species of microorganisms and algae floating around in the water there. All of those species would represent the community in that location. Same with like the Sahara scene. We have the giraffes and zebras, those are the obvious species. But we also have trees, we have different grasses, we have water, which means there's likely organisms living in the water, microorganisms, right? There's a lot of different species all together, same place, they're a community. All right, because we have many different species all in the same area, they're going to interact, and they will have different types of interactions. Right? Typically when we think of species interacting, we might think of competition, right? So they're fighting one another or they're competing for a resource. Here I have an image of barnacles competing for space on a rock, right? There's competition for space. But we have other interactions like mutualisms where both benefit, right? Here the hummingbird is getting the nectar out of the flower. The flower in turn is being pollinated by the hummingbird. We can have parasitism, right? So where one species is benefiting, the other is not benefiting at all. It's actually detrimental to the other, right? This, I believe, is an image of a tapeworm. Pathogens, right? Different bacteria species interacting with organisms. Here we have it interacting with a plant. Predation, which we talked about a little bit, right? But obviously one species is going to win, the other is not going to win. And we have herbivory, right? Organisms, plants, animals eating plants. Organisms, animals, and insects eating plants, right? The plants are being eaten, something is preying upon those plants. Lots of different species interactions. We're going to start with the big one, which is competition. So I've actually given you all the definitions on the slides, right? I have not left any of these blank this time around, just to make sure that we can get through the last bit of content this class period. So if we're thinking about competition, and I know we already defined this, but we have to think about a niche. And a niche is the total ways that a species uses its environment, right? So what food does it eat? What area does it occupy? Maybe the temperature and moisture of that area would be part of its niche, right? Any way that that organism uses the environment would be its niche. Now we start to see competition occurring when different species niches overlap, right? When they're competing for the same resource in their niche, right? So if we look at an example, we might have a species that eats seeds. And when we're looking at seeds, they prefer seed sizes that are kind of in this middle range here, right? Maybe their beaks can't open wide enough to eat the larger seeds, or maybe these smaller seeds are too hard to pick up, right? Something has made it so that they prefer those middle seeds. Now if we introduce another species, right, maybe the second species, species 2, also prefers seeds, but they prefer seeds that are a little bit larger, right? So they prefer the larger end of seeds. But for this species, some of those larger seeds overlap with the intermediate seeds that species 1 eats, right? So now we are starting to see competition occurring for that size of the seed, right? Their niches have overlapped. Their resources that they are using are overlapping. There's now competition for these intermediate, maybe slightly larger seeds, right? Now this just doesn't occur for food. It might be for water. Maybe you're competing for water holes. Maybe you're competing for your territory, right? Lots of different resources can be limited. All right, if we look at the types of competition, 2 different main types. We can say we have intra-specific competition, which is where we have competition between the same species, right? So maybe they're competing, in this case, competing over this food. Maybe they're competing for mates, right? But species that are the same are competing against one another. And it's kind of density dependent. So as we see a population increasing in size, there's more individuals, right? There's going to be more competition for those same resources for that same species. Then the other type, you might have guessed it, if it's between the same species, the other one has to be between different species. And that would be interspecific competition, right? I don't have a great way to remember this. I often think inter is like in between, right? They both have that TE in there. It's a very loose association, not the best way to remember it, but it's how my mind remembers it. But interspecific competition would be competition between different species. And I love this image up here of this chipmunk fighting for seeds with the birds. All right, so intra, same species. Inter, different species. Right?
I was going to say with inter, you could think of like interlined with each other because they don't really have like anything similar. I don't know.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Two E's and inter, so there's 2 different species.
2 E's and inter, 2 different species. I like all these methods that you guys are giving me so that in my future classes I can pass along these methods. Those are great. All right, so species are competing. What happens if two species compete, right? What might be the outcome? Well, that's what this scientist was asking in species of Paramecium. So Gregory Gossi, he studied 3 different species of the Paramecium. They are a very small, single-celled organism, right? They have all these different cilia around their edges that help them move. So the first thing he did was he grew them all separated from one another, right? So he guaranteed there was no competition. He grew up a population just to see what the population looked like. And he noticed that they all had logistic growth, right? We see an increase and then a plateau for every single one of these populations. And that plateau is likely occurring at the carrying capacity of whatever environment this was grown in, right? Maybe it was a beaker of water. All right, so he knows how they grow individually. Now he's going to try to figure out how do they grow when they're in competition with one another. So that's what he did, right? He took 2 of these species, right? And I'm going to say the species in red here versus the species in green. He grew them when they were in the same environment, so maybe they were in the same test tube, same beaker of water. And what he saw was that for one species, the species in red here, had logistic growth, right? It grew, it plateaued at the carrying capacity, right? Pretty normal. But the other species, it grew, and then that population absolutely plummeted, right? And that population essentially died out. So this is what we would call competition exclusion, where one species is winning over the other, or one species is excluding the other from an environment. All right, so for these 2 Paramecium species, right, the species represented by the red line excluded the species represented by this green line. Now, that's not always the case when competition occurs. One species is not necessarily always going to win, and one's always going to lose. Right? So he put 2 different Paramecium species together, and he saw a different result. What he saw was that both of these species showed logistic growth, right? They both grew and then plateaued out, right? One did not die off. So are we seeing evidence of competition here? Maybe, maybe not. If it is competition, it's not very obvious because they're both surviving, right? We might say that this one represented by the blue line has a lower population size, but if we looked at how they grew originally, this one in blue just typically has a lower population size in general, right? So both of these populations, they are surviving in the same environment, right? They are coexisting, all right? So not only can we have competitive exclusion, where one wins and one loses, we can also have coexistence, right? They find ways to survive in the same environment, right? One is not just going to completely die out. All right, so coexistence. They're coexisting in the same environment. How is this possible? How do they do this? Well, we're going to look at another study that looks at coexistence. But instead of Paramecium species, we're going to look at birds, right? And we're going to look at this concept known as resource partitioning. So, resource partitioning, this is where we might have one niche present, right? What we think of as one niche present. So in this experiment, our niche would be a spruce tree. That is where these warblers are living. They're all living in a spruce tree. But what the scientists found is that these warblers, even though they inhabited the same environment, same spruce tree, same part of the country, they actually partitioned out that spruce tree, and they used that spruce tree in different ways. So what we thought of as maybe only having one niche, one environment or way that they use their environment, there's actually several niches that have been partitioned out. Right? So if we look at these warblers, they are inhabiting different parts of the tree. Some like it at the top of the tree, some in the middle, some towards the bottom. Right? So they're using different parts of the tree. And they're probably, most likely, eating different types of organisms, right? So this Cape May warbler lives towards the tip of the tree here. Maybe it's eating flying insects, right? Insects that can fly and get higher up on the tree. Maybe insects are flying past the tree, right? But this myrtle warbler, right? It's inhabiting the lower part of the tree. Maybe this warbler is eating insects that can't fly, that stay closer to the ground. Maybe they live along the soil line, right? So even though they're all eating insects, they're all living in the same tree, they're doing it in different ways, right? Living in different parts of the tree, eating different types of insects. They are partitioning out their resources so that all the warblers can coexist together in the same environment. All right, so competition. We've seen competitive exclusion, we've seen coexistence, and resource partitioning is part of coexisting. So then what are those outcomes of competition? Exactly what I just said. You can either exclude somebody from the environment, one's gonna win, one's gonna lose, or you can coexist by partitioning out resources to meet your individual needs, right? So not all warblers are living in the same parts of the tree. Not all warblers are eating the same types of insects, right? So this leads us to a principle that's called the competitive exclusion principle. So this principle basically says two species cannot coexist indefinitely with one another when they're competing for the same limiting resource, right? So if they're both eating the same type of seeds, right, they're not going to be indefinitely able to live in the same environment at the same time, unless they partition out that resource, right? Unless they divide it up. And this really depends on the environment, right? What is the limiting factor? Is it the physical environment? Right? Is it geographical ranges or territories? Is it access to water? Maybe it's food or nutrient availability. Right? Maybe there are not enough rabbits to sustain two different species of like wolves or like wolves and coyotes. Are there any predators present? Right? All of these play into outcomes of this competition, right? And how each species is going to survive. Completely varies depending on the species, depending on the resource. So, big picture, right? Species with the exact same requirements cannot live together in the same place at the same time, right? They cannot occupy the same niche. Right? If we see species that we think occupy the same niche and they're both surviving, likely we have to take a closer look, and they might have completely different niches in the way that they use that environment. All right, so competition. It's one we often think of when we think of species interacting with one another. And competition is pretty common, right? In fact, studies have shown when two species are in the same place at the same time, right, competition is almost always reported, about 90% of the time, right? So it's a very common thing that occurs. Plants, in particular, they are really good at competing, right? Insects, animals, they can move. Plants cannot. They are stuck wherever their seeds sprouted. So they have to be really good at competing for the water or the nutrients in the soil that's around them, right? Because they simply cannot just uproot themselves and move to the nearest patch of sunlight or to the next area of high nutrients, right? So they have to be really good at competing. Same with marine organisms, right? Typically organisms that live in this intertidal region, right? So where the tides come in and out, think big oceans, right? That region, that intertidal region, has a very specific environment. Sometimes it's submerged in water, sometimes it's not submerged in water, right? So the individuals, the organisms that are adapted to that very specific environment have to compete for a very limited amount of space on the rocks in this intertidal region, right? So we tend to see a lot of competition in this intertidal space. All right, I've talked a lot. So what I want you to do is I want you to find an example that you'd be willing to share with the class of competition. I want you to tell me, is it intraspecific or interspecific, right? And are those organisms coexisting or are they excluding one another? What was that? Market. Oh, there's competition. Oh yes. My husband and I are actively looking, and it's rough out there.
It'll be even rougher for us.
Oh, I know. I feel so bad because we have it tough.
No, it's Gable.
It's a good example.
Living on the street.
Those birds.
Okay, so an example of competition. I mean,
Yeah,
has two E's. Yeah, so interspecific has two E's, which is two E's in species. Intro is one, so it's one's
Yeah.
Yeah, can you have additive extending coexistence if it's yeah.
You're supposed to be like John Boyd.
All right, does anybody have an example of competition that they would like to share?
Fungi versus bacteria.
Fungi versus bacteria, inter or intra? Interspecific, two different species. Do you know, is one winning or are they coexisting? Yeah, they can coexist. Yeah, there's many examples of fungi coexisting with bacteria. What else? Anybody else have an example?
Woodpeckers and squirrels fighting for the same place to live in tree.
Ah, there we go. Yes, intra.
Inter.
Interspecific competition. Are they coexisting or excluding?
Excluding.
They are excluding. One is winning, right? One's getting that hollow in the tree and the other is not. Yeah. All right. I told my other class an example of intraspecific competition. I have two cats. It's cold right now. I sit at night with a blanket on my lap. They compete for that space on my lap, right? They're the same species, intraspecific competition, and they are competitively excluding one another. One gets the lap, one does not, right? So lots and lots of examples of competition out there. Any questions about competition? All right. There are other ways that species interact with one another, right? We talked about competition, but I also mentioned there's predation, there's herbivory, there's parasitoidism, right? These other interactions are defined based on how lethal are they and how long is the interaction between those two species. So if we look at our graph here, we have lethality on the x-axis and duration of the interaction on the y-axis. If we look at herbivory, this would be where an animal or an insect feeds on a plant, right? A plant is being eaten. The duration of the interaction is pretty low, right? It doesn't take long for a deer to take a bite of grass, right? Matter of seconds. The lethality is also pretty low, right? A deer grazing on grass is not going to kill the grass. The grass can regrow, right? So it's not lethal, not a lot of interaction occurring, not a lot of time for that interaction to occur. So herbivory, low on both sides, but on the opposite end of that spectrum, right? Maybe we have, again, a low duration of the interaction, but the lethality is high, right? Maybe we're talking about predators, right? The amount of time it takes for a predator to catch its prey is not going to be a matter of days, probably not a matter of hours, but maybe minutes, right? And that prey is going to die if that predator is successful, right? It's highly lethal, right? So low duration of interaction, high lethality. You're probably most familiar with herbivory and predation, right? But we also have parasitoidism, right? So this is where we might have a parasite that establishes itself on another species. Typically, the length of the interaction is going to be fairly long. It's not a matter of seconds or minutes, but rather a matter of probably days or even weeks, right? So think about this tick that is living on the deer, right? It's going to stay attached to the deer for quite a while. But the lethality of that tick on the deer is likely quite low, right? Typically, organisms are not going to die from having a tick, drink its blood as its food source. Now, it can lead to lethality in some cases. It can impart certain diseases that could be lethal. But in general, not super lethal. Versus our last one, which is probably one you haven't heard of too much, which is parasitoidism. This is where, again, that duration of the interaction is pretty high, right? Larvae or different insects, organisms are going to lay eggs on the host. Those eggs are going to stay on the host until it hatches. When those eggs hatch, the larvae typically tend to eat the host as its first food source or as its first meal. So duration, pretty high. All right, again, we're talking a matter of days or even weeks. Lethality, also pretty high. All right, by the end of the larvae hatching, right, they're going to eat their host. Their host is going to die, right? So all these different interactions, right, that we can define based on length of the interaction and the lethality of the interaction. All right, there are so many ways that species can interact, and interact in ways where one species is going to lose, the other species might win, right? So organisms have to have some sort of a defense system, right? And there are many different anti-predator defense systems out there. We're going to go through examples of each, right? Such as chemical defenses, mimicry, or armor, or weaponry. This is my favorite part of the lecture because I get to tell you a bunch of cool organism facts. So we're going to start by looking at those chemical defenses, right? This is one way that organisms can have to fight back against predation. Right? So chemical defenses, anything chemical in nature, right? One example is this bombardier beetle, right? So when it's intimidated, in this case it's intimidated by a pair of tweezers, it actually ejects this hot spray towards its predator to try to make that predator back off, right? That hot spray is its chemical defense, right? It's trying to defend itself from whatever is attacking it. We might have other organisms that have some sort of a chemical defense. Maybe it's a poison, right? Maybe it's a spray. And they typically also have a specific color that goes with them, or a specific pattern. So aposematic coloration is typically hand in hand with a type of chemical defense. So if we think of, say, the poison dart frog, right? This poison dart frog, while very pretty and charismatic, is very, very lethal, all right? This is a potent frog. Its skin has a poison on it, all right? So it's brightly colored to try to warn predators from eating it, right? It's saying, don't eat me. If you eat me, it's likely you're going to die, right? So it has this really bright coloration because of its chemical defenses. One that you might be familiar with, right, in this area is a skunk, right? It has a chemical defense. It can spray you with that really noxious gas. It also has some aposematic coloration, right? It has that white stripe, that very characteristic white stripe down its back, right? Saying, stay away from me or you're going to smell a really disgusting smell. So lots of different chemical defenses. They're not just isolated to animals or insects though, right? Chemical defenses, very, very common in plants. So plants, they will synthesize a whole range of compounds. Some of these compounds might be things like nicotine, morphine, cocaine, caffeine, right? These are all molecules that are synthesized by plants to try to deter predators. Now, we can take these and use them for our own means in human society here, but they were originally developed by the plant to ward off predators. Right? Latex is another example of this. So I don't know if you took a walk in the coneflower prairie on campus here in the fall, maybe you saw some milkweed growing, right? Milkweed has a latex in it. That latex is very toxic to mammals. It can cause very extreme, like different heart functions in vertebrates, right? It can affect your heart. So you don't want to eat latex. This is an image of a plant. This is a coffee plant. And all of those green and red pods are maturing coffee beans, right? Caffeine wasn't developed so we could drink coffee, right? But was developed for the plant to ward off insects by literally paralyzing insects. We are drinking kind of a poison, yeah. Another one is jasmonic acid. Right? It's an acid that the plants, once it's been eaten by a predator, will release this acid to warn other invading insects that, hey, I was just bitten, and now I'm going to taste really, really bad if you try to eat me again. Right? So chemical defenses in plants are really, really common. Because again, they can't move. They have to defend where they are staying at that very precise moment. Cocaine, I don't know the specific example, but it's some sort of a chemical defense to deter either insects or animals from eating. Yeah, so cocaine is lethal to, like, the insects. All right, our next type of defense is camouflage. Pretty self-explanatory. I feel like we all know what camouflage is. All right, so maybe it's camouflage in the oceans. We have this pygmy seahorse camouflaging with the corals, right? Octopuses or octopi. Actually, I think the correct term is octopuses, right? They can actually change their colors and blend in with their environment. Some organisms, they can't change their colors, but they have evolved to look like their habitat, like this owl here. Right? The feather coloration of the owl looks very similar to the tree behind it, right? That is great camouflage. It might be toads that look like dead leaves, right? At first glance, you might think there's only leaves in this image. What about this one? Can anybody find what's hiding in this picture? I know on my slides I have it circled, but yeah, there's a cheetah in there, right? It's very well camouflaged into its environment. So camouflage, very, very common defense. Often predators, prey, might have camouflage in addition to other defenses. All right, another type of defense is mimicry, right? This is where a species might mimic a toxic species. There's two types of mimicry, right? One is Batesian mimicry. This is where we have two species. One is toxic, one is not toxic. But the one that is non-toxic looks like the toxic species. So we have a coral snake here, very toxic, very venomous, right? And then we have this scarlet king snake that is not venomous, all right? It's pretty benign. If an animal eats it, it's not going to die, right? But it looks very close to the coral snake. It's trying to mimic that venomous species to try to fool that predator into thinking that it is toxic. So that's Batesian mimicry. We also have Mullerian mimicry. Mullerian mimicry is where both species are toxic, but they look like each other, right? They're mimicking one another. So the monarch butterfly and this other butterfly here, the Viscerae butterfly, right? They look very similar. I would probably say that they're both monarchs if I saw them out in the wild. I'm not an entomologist. I probably would not pick up on those subtle details, right? But they are both toxic, right? The monarch butterfly is actually toxic because it feeds on milkweed, and we just saw milkweed has latex, and latex is toxic, which makes the monarch butterfly toxic in return. They're actually resistant to that latex. It doesn't harm them. But if another mammal comes along and eats it, right, it will harm that mammal. But they're both mimicking each other. They're trying to reinforce that orange, that bright orange color means toxic. So Batesian mimicry, non-toxic species, mimicking the toxic species. Mullerian mimicry, two toxic species are mimicking each other. All right, my next slide is also going to show an example of Mullerian mimicry. And that's mimicry in bees and wasps, right? So these species inhabit the same area, right? Same environment. But they have, or I should say, they do have same traits, right? Their traits are that they are yellow and they typically have a striped pattern to them, right? With those black stripes on their abdomens, right? They are not related by a common ancestor, but rather these traits arose independently to mimic each of these toxic species. So basically, to a predator, it's reinforcing this idea that if I am yellow and I have black stripes, I am likely toxic. You do not want to eat me. All right? So they're mimicking one another to reinforce this idea. So as a whole, predators will shy away from these yellow striped insects. All right. That's mimicry. We have a few more. We also have displays of intimidation, right? So maybe you've seen a cartoon. I don't know if this one shows up in Finding Nemo or not, but the pufferfish, right? If you were to poke a pufferfish, it'll swell up to these giant sizes to make it look bigger than it actually is to the predator, right? Try to ward off the predator by looking big. Same with this owl, right? This owl is using its feathers on its wings to try to intimidate that cat, right? To try to make it look bigger than it actually is. Lizard is doing the same thing here, right? I don't know the terminology for that skin around their neck, right? But that skin is flaring out. It's making that lizard look really, really big, right? I remember when I was probably elementary school, I walked out behind my house, right, and there was a deer there, and that deer started to like mock charge me because it felt threatened. It was trying to intimidate me by charging me, right? That is also a display of intimidation. It's not making it look big, but making it feel threatening, right? Lots of different ways of intimidating your predator. And finally, we have armor and weaponry. And this is probably what you're thinking of when you're thinking of a defense for an organism, is some sort of like armor, like giant claws on this grizzly bear, right? Or thorns on a plant. Maybe horns to try to fight their enemies, right? Turtle shells are examples of this. Beetles, exoskeleton, they're hard. Those are examples of a type of armor. I really like this example of the honey locust, right? This is one of my favorite trees because of its history. So you can cultivate a honey locust and they don't have these thorns. But when you find them in the wild, these thorns are massive, right? They are so long and they are all up and down the trunk of the tree. The reason that these thorns evolved were to protect the tree against the herbivore of the woolly mammoth, right? So even though the woolly mammoth is extinct, its predation or its armor still exists on these trees, right? And I mean, these spines are huge. It's spines that you would not believe would come out of a tree. All right, we talked a lot about defenses, and a lot of these defenses did not involve combat, right? We only really talked about armor and weaponry in that last slide where we talked about claws and horns and spines, right? So why is it that most of these defenses do not involve combat? I want you to think about the question, and then we'll come back and share.
I hate watching
Terrifying.
One and one.
It's always fascinating when I try to tear them apart and figure out the one still attached to the other.
I have one in my hand, the other one's just
Is that a question or a stretch?
No, I think me and the bear. I'll kill a bear.
But yeah,
Bear. It's like a stick and I just hit him.
You probably get killed first. His head on him.
Hand on him.
Exactly. And once you get wounded, you have to hide from your predator still. You don't have a nice like brick building a hospital.
Looking for a key assault. I'll take him down. I just
my professor just told me like second year class canceled.
yeah, that's what he said.
Well, which, no, it's not nice. Because we have peer review for a paper,
Okay.
and then we were also gonna work on our computer today
Okay.
in class. So now it's canceled, I can't ask them.
No way you didn't say that. High school.
Email.
I can see why that's
You know what? You don't take every day. I guess you had that one.
No, I like on Friday too. We only have 15 minutes with her because of the peer mall.
Okay. You have to use that time to work on your speech independently.
Yeah,
Come
I can.
in and ask.
I don't
What
understand.
just happened?
So he's just like, she's always gives me like unsolicited advice on how I should do myself with my disability. And I'm like, I think I haven't figured that out in my 21 years of life, how to take care of myself. I'm like, yeah. Yeah.
All right, so why don't we think combat is very common in nature across all the different defenses that an organism can have?
More dangerous.
It's dangerous. It's risky. Yeah, what else? The prey might not win, right? One might win, one might lose, right? Maybe if you don't lose, you get injured, right? And that can affect how you hunt, right? For your own food. So it's risky. It costs a lot of energy, right? You have to put a lot of energy into fighting, right? So animals will prefer to not have that risk, not have that energy cost associated, and try to avoid predators and other mechanisms. All right, any questions on this? All right, our last type of interaction that we haven't discussed yet are predators, right? So predators can have major effects on a community. If we think about the Burmese pythons in Florida, which we talked about on Monday, they are an invasive species in Florida. They do not have a natural predator. They are affecting this community in massive ways, right? They are killing off a lot of wildlife. So there's been like a 99% decline in raccoons. Deer are down like 94%. Bobcats 87%. There's absolutely no more rabbits or fox in the area because they killed them all. Right? They've had massive effects on the environment because they do not have a natural predator. They are the apex species in this environment. Right, so this is an example of like an invasive species when no predator is present. There's also an example of a species that is invasive, the prickly pear cactus. This was introduced into Australia, and in Australia, it's an invasive species, and it became a huge problem, right? It grew out of control, right? It decimated rangelands, right? It took over the land. Cows couldn't graze. Cows aren't going to eat this type of plant anyways because it's hard, it's full of spines, right? It became a massive problem. So what we did was we introduced a predator. We introduced this small cactus moth, right, that feeds upon the prickly pear cactus. And what happens was when we introduced this predator, right, we controlled that prickly pear population. That prickly pear population went down. So now these farmers can have their lifestyle back. These cattle can graze, right? We manage the population by having a natural predator in place. So predators, real world consequences, right? When there are either too many predators or no predators at all. I'm actually going to skip over this thought question, and we're going to finish up so we can get to the content check, which is a fairly easy content check today. Right, my last slide is about types of interactions that are not detrimental to one party. Right, so we've been talking about herbivory and predation and competition, right? Things where something either wins or is affected by another species in a negative way. Well, sometimes species interact and it's either good for both species or one species might win, the other species doesn't really matter. Mutualism, right, is an example of this. This is where both species are going to win. Classic example is pollination by insects on flowers. Right? The insects, they get the nectar from the flower. The flower, they get to spread their pollen using these insects. They both win. It's a win-win situation. All right, so both species can win. Maybe it's commensalism, where one species wins, the other is not affected. Right? So I don't know if you have a pet that goes out in like prairies in the fall. They come back with all these burrs on their fur. These seeds have these barbs specifically meant to hook into the fur of mammals. The plant wins because the animals are spreading these seeds much further than these seeds could be spread by themselves. What might be annoying for the dog or might be annoying for you to pick it off of your dog, right? That dog isn't losing in any way, right? It's kind of negligible, right? It doesn't really affect the dog beyond being just annoying, right? Same for other mammals in the environment. Maybe it's not a dog, maybe it's a bear or a deer that these seeds have hooked onto, right? Seeds are really benefiting. The other party, they could care less. It just might be annoying. All right, that is the last of the content. So we don't have much left, right? We just have Friday and then the final exam, whether you decided to take it on Monday, which most of you are, or those alternate days. Friday, scientific literacy assignment. We'll talk about that a little bit. It'll be due during class time. And then we'll do some exam prep. All right, the content check should be pretty easy. All right, so I want you to consider a population of deer that has access to abundant but limited supply of resources. I want you to draw on a graph what that type of growth would look like and what is that growth called. I figured we all needed an easy content check for today. Well, there's lots of it, but at a certain point, that population is going to grow so big that it's just not going to no.
So it's
What type of growth is that?
yeah.
The other one.
That's with L. Logistic, yes.
Yeah, logical.
I mean, logical, logistic, so similar. You're turning it in on paper. I do have a stapler if you did. Yeah. You wrote down the name of it?
Yes.
Perfect.
And then I woke up told myself, oh no, I'm not good enough yet, so I set it to 15, gave myself another 15 minutes. I mean, I didn't have class on my thing, but like, it's not that I'm
So I should go in.
I also get to sleep in, and I'm going home all night, because I have the appointment thing.
You disagree. Do you think the natural ways of life,
Sleep in my own bed.
first technology will take
I would.
Oh shit.
Still hate it. No, when you label it, you're supposed
I have every day.
You wanna see?
You know what I'm saying?
Some club that one week.
Why you always do? I've always known you want to do.
Yeah.
That's not, that's the only thing I want to do. Or take that back, you want to see another. That is.
After wishing no one
Yeah, see ya.
People thought Teslas were spaceships. No, they're just jelly beans. Yeah, I think. Do you?
that is
Perfect.
thank you.
I don't like yeah, minus that. I'm not paying it.
Yeah, see ya.
It was not working for me. I like had it on my and then it just kept opening it instead of dragging it into the thing. And I was like, no, it's not working for me. Yeah. But it was done. It just wasn't turning itself in.
Do you know if like who might buy if I pass that class but not pass this grade shit I want? Do you know if they'll be like actually want to like prerequisite or should I ask my advisor about it?
So I asked.
Yeah, so say you pass this class, don't pass it. Right, let's work with that scenario. You would have to pass the route portion before going on to the next 100 class. But you can do the next 100 class while you wait. Okay.
But here is
He's right over
so
there.
I'm like,
Are we calling for
Eat
the cheese.
but this might
Well, it depends on the requirements of what you're going through. They have different requirements. Yeah. It's something to ask them. Yeah. But unless you absolutely take it in the last final exam. Like 0%. I don't think you will. Yes. I don't think you'll be fine.
I think I'll be fine.
Have a good day.
Yeah, you as well.
Thank you.
I'll let you know.
See you on Friday.
Yeah, see ya.
Wait, allopatric is when species stuff comes in the same, or are originally the same, and they like separated into one population.
Yeah, separated two different populations because of why?
Something happened.
Yeah.
Something happened, something. What in nature? Is it a natural process or is it a
It could be either,
geology
or is it one of the
process?
geographically separated?
It's when they're physically
So
separated.
that means for this question it has to be assumed. I think. These two hogs live in the same area.
Wow, they're in the same area. What's happening to the hogs?
Dying.
These two hogs live in the same, both of them in the same kind of ancestry, but are two different species.
No, they live in the same area. That's telling you.
There's some.
Patrick.
Yes. Yes.
Now, can they agree? Do they want to?
I don't know how to
And then
make.
they agree, all agree at different times of year. All questions we can ask in biology.
All questions? Yup.
You know, we only discovered 3% of our ocean.
Yes, because the oceans are huge and we don't have enough technology to.
Oceans were so scary, we decided to go to space.
You know who's probably gonna figure out how to search the ocean?
Me.
Elon Musk.
My favorite conspiracy theory is that aliens live in our oceans because we haven't explored.
Aliens are not real.
Whoa, I never thought of that.
That is my favorite conspiracy.
That is a good
I
one.
also don't believe that the megalodon is real.
What?
It was real.
It's a
fossil.
That's like saying you don't believe that dinosaurs exist. That's the same thing. I don't believe that
No,
dinosaurs
it's not.
exist.
I believe the Earth is round.
Well,
Oh,
that's
I thought you were about to say
Good
it's flat. I actually thought you were about to say it's flat first.
no, not at all.
Isn't it like scientifically proven that it's round? How does it rotate if it was flat? don't
I do
understand
not
how
know the
people-
conspiracies
I don't
behind
understand how
that
people
one.
think that.
That's where a good education and critical thinking
just about to
skills
say.
come into play.
Are you gonna put your name on that?
My name is on it.
Oh,
Don't ever sleep on me ever.
I'm gonna sleep on it.
Tom, better get used to it. Wait, actually, what colors is that red? Oh my gosh, that's
Red.
actually mine, yeah.
It's yours?
I noticed yesterday.
Okay. Is that your calculator too?
Yes.
I can't wait until we bring back.
Good.
Geochemistry was going to be not fun without this.
Oh no.
Thank you.
Yes.
Scientists are trying
I'm
to.
glad it found its odor.
Back to the
There's a
United States.
notebook in the front of the classroom. I know it's from somebody in biology. Still hasn't been claimed. It's
Was
been
it?
2 months.
I know, yeah, I found one.
Well,
but I
yeah.
don't know what it is.
To start off.
Yeah.
It could be the note.
Is it this one?
It's just under the table here.
No, but it's the circle of life.
Like it has lots of notes in it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's got
I don't know.
cool drawing.
Yeah, very cool drawing. It looks like this is something that Yuta does in his class. So it must be one of his students. So it's biology.
Yeah.
They're missing a lot of their information. But
Got full test score right there.
I don't know. Oh, that one has a name on it. I know who this belongs to. Okay.
There you go. Could be. You just said it yourself. There's
I should have paid more attention 2 months ago.
I wonder who else, what other shark this is, probably. You think they completely made this? You think that this isn't a fossil? You think it's completely made up?
I think it's both.
You are so weird. You are actually so weird. Did your parents tell you that?
Show me evidence that that thing's real.
It's right there. So you're saying all dinosaur fossils are fake, basically?
Show me evidence in today's world that that thing is real.
That right there.
They probably found it in
Evidence in today's
Actually
world.
dumb.
That is. What? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. I think it's really funny.
Such a specific example too. Just the megalodon.
Yeah, but like, how about all the other dinosaurs that were on the planet? Those are real, though. Those ones are real. That is a losing argument I've ever heard of. Let's go get him before he escapes.